in this day and age, we're in a time where people have a lot to process. And so it is critical in working to build out these networks that you're able to sell a very clear message. But I share this very carefully because, again, when I started doing what I'm doing right now especially, I, in essence, had no clue what I was doing, right? I kind of had this vision here and had this idea that I wanted to be a part of transforming the Caribbean, but I had no idea how. And so I spent quite a bit of time selling this thing that was in my head, but which came, when I spoke, it came out very ambiguously, right? And so I think a lot of people would have this experience as startups and such like that when you're getting going, you don't fully understand the exact sell that carries your message across. And that's where the repetition side is very important, because the more you sell it, the more you start to get it. But it is critical that one of your focuses then becomes clarity in message. And then I'd also just say, there's 7 billion people on the planet. Have no fear about reaching out to folks. And in essence, you will fail with making connections with some of those, selling those stories that I'm talking about now, until you start reaching this message of clarity. And the more people understand and understand and understand, the easier it is to start winning these contacts and winning success with what you're trying to sell to them. But I think one big key is just casting the net as wide as possible, reaching out to as many folks as you can, and not being afraid of the fact that many, many people will either not respond to you, tell you no, etc., etc. But you just have to keep selling. And then another critical thing, which was pointed to earlier again, is that if you're going to be reaching out through social media, especially like LinkedIn, one key thing is ensuring that your profile is actually set up in a way that people, again, the message is communicated as clearly as possible, right? And that people will be very quickly able to kind of understand you. And the free press thing starts to come into play again, because people Google things, right? So the moment you reach out to someone, one of the first things they do is, just like you probably do, is go onto Google, search your name, and if they can't find anything, right, it presents a little bit of a challenge, right? So you want to find a way to really develop a digital footprint, a lot of which comes through free digital online press, which can be through blogs, etc., etc. You just have to be open to telling the story of what you firstly want to achieve, and then I guess as you start to achieve what you have achieved to people.
We have a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirk and Roger. This is fascinating. You talk a lot about changing the narrative, which strikes a big chord with me. What we're talking about essentially is changing the culture. And that's what I've come back to Barbados to do. When you're talking to the diaspora or international people with influence that you want to utilize, and you're telling them that the Caribbean that you are essentially selling to them is not the Caribbean that they know or have heard of, that's one part of the puzzle. But how do we actually go about creating the Caribbean that you are selling?
That's it?
That's it.
So
I should be more clear. What I'm saying is, how do we go about creating a culture here in the Caribbean that is imaginative, productive, fearless, and open?
I understand you from a very simple standpoint, right? Which is that I sell a vision, and then on the other side, sometimes, something will then happen in Jamaica where you're like, this is so just not what I'm,
this is life,
wanting to tell people. However, I believe very strongly in vision, and especially in, as I mentioned earlier, the long-term play. So for me, this is not necessarily an immediacy. This is about, when you talk about creating culture, it is about culturing people into a community that can be transformative, right? It is also about, though, opening doors and highlighting the folks that fit into the space that you are talking about. Because one of the things that has been missing in the Caribbean is just simply platforms. So it's not that we don't have creative, innovative, imaginative people and organizations, right? It's simply that this that we're doing right now is not a regular event. And these platforms in the Caribbean actually tend to be very academic in their styling and very technical and not very vision driven, right? So again, it can't be immediate, and that's just reality. But there is, one thing I've seen through traveling the world is that there's no such thing as utopia, right? And everywhere has their challenges. So when people come to me with the negative Jamaica narrative, which is, Kirk, the reality of Jamaica is this, I think on the other side, which is just, I wake up every morning and I simply cannot buy into the idea that what I see around me is all that is possible. And what we then are selling is the idea of possibility and for people to buy into potential, which when you think of places like Silicon Valley and some of our desires here, which is, you raise the big capital and you do this, essentially people are investing in potential. When a guy wakes up one day and says, I'm going to transform the automotive industry and have people start sharing cars, or I'm going to start having people share homes, right? That's someone buying into a vision that is not yet at all proven. And I'll give you a very simple example. When I was in Davos, will.i.am sat on the stage with the founder of Airbnb and told a very candid story of how he went to the office of Airbnb when they were just getting started and were far enough along that they had an office, essentially. And he basically was like, this is stupid. Like, why would I ever rent an apartment room from someone or ever rent out my apartment? And he was at least willing to speak now as the person who got it wrong, saying, dude, what you've done is magnificent. So again, to put it against my story, I almost woke up one day and started saying to people that, we're going to start selling this transformative message to the world and start attracting these kind of folks to Jamaica and all this kind of stuff. I didn't know a lot of the people that I needed to bring. I thought I knew them, right? But as our network has evolved and as we've increased in success and all that kind of stuff, the people that we are now attracting into these markets are nothing like the people who I knew at the beginning. And the media attention that we're starting to garner is not the media attention, or at least not the kind of connectivity that I had in the beginning. I just somehow believed that this stuff was possible. So if you at all buy into the idea that we have achieved something in the short 2 years that we've been doing what we're doing, then I would say the 10-year story is even more fantastic, and not just for our organization, but for the people of the Caribbean on a whole. That's the best answer I can give, and I hope it's helpful.
You have a final question?
Hi, it's on? Okay. Morning. Okay, so I had the privilege of living in Jamaica for some time, and somewhere along the way I kind of, without even knowing it, picked up the accent. So when I came back, everybody was like, who's this crazy girl? Where's she from? And why is she saying, all these different things? Because one thing about being able to live away from home for a little bit is that you get a different perspective. So coming back to Barbados and having experienced some of the things that I did, I again wanted to change some of the things. And they just can't, sometimes they're not nice. So you'll always hear, who's this crazy girl and why is she trying, I'm tired of hearing it. The crazy girl, because Einstein was thought to be crazy too. And now we have stuff. And I'm sure if you got up one day and said, I'm going to bring billionaires to Jamaica, and people are like, well, who's this crazy boy and what's he saying? At some point, though, it gets to you. So how did you push past the negativity that can come from your own? Because yes, I am Barbadian. Yes, I grew up here. But having lived in Jamaica for 6 years, some things come out Jamaican without me even knowing it. And it's not that I am trying to not be Bajan. It just happens. Sometimes I don't even know which part is Jamaica, which part is Barbados anymore. So how did you push past the negative? Because I'm sure living in Barbados, you picked up some things that are Bajan as well.
Yes. I think the way I'd answer that is this, right? So you just used a very good example, which is Einstein, who's not from Barbados, but was considered crazy. And the reality is, this exists everywhere. There's certain conditions in the Caribbean because we're, small, and we are actually very close-knit beyond what we understand, and it's actually something that could be very valuable to us if we were willing to leverage it. But unfortunately, a lot of times it's used as we say, bad mind or malicious or whatnot. But these realities exist everywhere, right? So I have friends in New York who are crazy. I have friends in Miami who are crazy. It may not kind of come around as quickly to them in terms of the messaging, but once you are participating in, like entrepreneurship is a very niche community, regardless of how sprawling it starts to seem. And so once you start falling into those circles, and these are the people that you need or whatnot, the messages do start to come back around. Eventually, I think it just comes down to the level of belief you have in what you're doing, right? No doubt I've heard things about myself that have been very painful, coming from Jamaicans, right? Coming from Jamaicans who have sat within a room who didn't say what they said to other people to me. And so when you have, I think the most important thing about pursuit is that you will fail, and then the most critical thing is that you do get back up, or at least if you do get back up, that is where you start to find success. And once you get up and you continue on your journey, you eventually start realizing that it really doesn't matter, right? Because there's one group of people who might think, oh, you're crazy, and then there's one group of people who buys into it. The important thing is starting to kind of filter out the noise of the ones who are negative, right? And listening more to the ones who aren't calling you crazy. And I'm not saying it's easy by any means, because, there's this myth that's sold about people like, I would say, Richard Branson and these guys who exist at the top and therefore have no doubts and no fears, and, nobody is talking about them or anything like that. Some of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world are some of the most hated people on the planet, right? People talk about them every single day in a negative light. And that is something that is definitely very difficult to deal with. But I think eventually while you'll take it in for maybe a minute or two, you learn to just quickly start moving on, right? And then one of the things that I always find funny about entrepreneurship, and I think it might be a good tactic, is every time you hear that you're crazy, just get slightly crazier, right? So I always find it interesting that when I have a failure, right? So I walk into a meeting with this thing in my head, like, okay, I'm gonna close this guy, they're gonna do this, that, and that with me. And I walk into a room and I meet this kind of lukewarm reception, right? And it's like, Kirk, whatever, not that big a deal. We're not gonna do this. And you leave and you kind of hit yourself with all these doubts, like, man, why am I doing this? This is not working, whatever. And you go to bed and you wake up the next day like, it needs to be bigger. That's why. That's why it failed. I need to go in. This room that I'm going into today, I'm going to take them a bigger message, right? And I think that's just what you have to do every time this comes around, right? And not to talk for too long, but I'll just share one thing with you. I deal with a lot of high net worth individuals, right? And in society then that, for whatever reason, starts to drive a certain level of importance. And in essence, they are critical to a lot of my mission. And so when you do hear the things that you're talking about coming from that community sometimes, it is a lot to absorb, right? But again, like I said, you end up just waking up the next day just starting to cast a bigger and bigger vision. And what you find is, as I said, some people will hear it and buy into it, and some people won't. The critical thing is just to keep moving and pushing yourself to not let it really pull you down, even though it is likely to affect you slightly. I don't think anybody is totally immune to the effects of what entrepreneurship really is.
Okay. We'll take one last question because I'm being pulled from the stage, but we'll definitely take this one last question.
I'll make it quick. Morning, Kirk. Maria Kublal Singh. I'm wondering if in building out your vision and your platform, if you had to engage the politicians, and if you did, at what point did you do that, and how did you find it most beneficial to do it?
Okay, I love that being the closing one, actually. So, it's interesting because when I started out, right, with this, I was actually all about bypassing government. That's what I used to sell to people. I used to be like, listen, you know, a lot of the challenges that we face are because of government, and so you need to be able to push yourself beyond government. And I do think there's a reality there, especially in the Caribbean, right? Because we talk a lot about government, and we almost think that government is supposed to be our savior. And the realities of entrepreneurship is that it's about innovation. And one thing that we don't do very well is innovate to a level that you essentially get around the stopping points that the government has put in place. When you think about, and I don't want to posit this as necessarily amazing anymore, but when you think about the Airbnbs and the Ubers of the world, that's what they did. But then there's another side to reality, which is that in any democracy, government is in control. So what you notice with those kind of big visionary ideas is they start out kind of bypassing, and then eventually they have to find some balance. So I would say the same for me. There was a time where I wanted no involvement with the political realm, and now we have pretty good involvement with the political realm, right? So like the Prime Minister participates in our community, the Minister of Tourism participates in our community, and so they serve a critical role, right? I think government is extremely important, more and more. But I also think that it is very important that you find ways to position government within your goals and not the opposite way around. And then also, it is also critical for people to understand more and more. We love to go to the government and tell them what we want, right? And not discounting all the dynamics that exist in the Caribbean around our governments, which tend to have very, similar traits. There's a certain reality, which is that they do have a job and they do have constituents and all these kind of things. And so we all have to learn to sell a message that applies to their self-interest, because they have a goal, right? And the more you can tap into that goal is, I think, the more you'll see coming out of them. And again, messaging is absolutely critical in that regard. So yeah, I mean, end of the day, it is unavoidable in a structure like this that you participate and work with the government. As to whether or not you become a politician yourself, I would argue, that's definitely not necessary. But you end up seeing where they do have to come in to what you're doing, especially if it's a grand vision. And unless you're going to change politics completely. Like I have a friend in the UK who's working to totally transform politics and create a whole new political party and a whole new political mindset. Naturally, that is a very, very big job to take on. So he sits in a world on his own. I would say you end up having to work with them.
Thank you very much, Kirk.
Thank you.
So just to wrap up, I'd like to say a special thanks to both Kirk and Melanie for sharing their purposeful, inspiring thoughts around brand building, scaling, and hopefully we take away a lot from this session. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kirk.
Hello. Hi. Yes. Thank you very much, Kurt and Melanie and Roger. Thank you for doing that. We're going to break now for just about 20 minutes. We'll be back here at 11 to start with the pitches. Thank you.